Greetings, everyone. I understand my mandate from the boss to keep the speakers to their 20 minutes and to say as little else as possible. In particular, you've already met all of our speakers, Joseph Wong, Julian Heins, and Yongshik Bong, so I don't really think we need to introduce them anymore. So with that, on that note, we're going to be talking about the impact, if any, of democracy and democratization, and we'll start off, I believe we said with Joe. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So starting with Joseph Wong, 20 minutes, and he can take questions himself. Thank you.
Great. I won't take 20 minutes. I think it'll be, there's plenty of people in here who will have important things to say about this, and hopefully we'll generate some conversation. So I just want to make 3 points. The first is basically I want to argue that that while TJ has identified an important mechanism for potential change, that being political democratization in Taiwan and Korea, I want to make the argument partly because I do believe it, partly also just to generate conversation, that in many ways it overstates, that TJ is overstating the causal impact of democratization on the transformation, demise, or however you want to evaluate out the other end the developmental state and developmentalism. And I'll make 3 points. The first is, so I'm currently writing a book with Dan Slater from Chicago, and basically we're arguing that the modal pathway of democratic transition in Asia, and we're looking at both Northeast and Southeast Asia, the modal pathway of democratization actually are conservative transitions. And so the argument we make in Taiwan actually is the best case for this. Basically, the argument we're making here is that whereas the conventional wisdom suggests that authoritarian regimes will concede democracy from a position of weakness, that is to say, when authoritarian regimes are so thoroughly delegitimated they have no other choice, what we actually see happening in East Asia and Southeast Asia are authoritarian regimes that are actually conceding democracy from what we call a position of strength. They're actually conceding democracy when they're strong. Or in other words, they're conceding democracy when they don't really have to, but for strategic reasons, they're making that concession. The best example being the KMT. When the KMT, particularly when Jiang Jingguo allows the DPP to form in 1986, lifts martial law in 1987, most observers of Taiwanese politics expected that the KMT would quash the burgeoning opposition, but in fact we see the allowance of the opposition to occur, full-scale legislative elections in '92, presidential elections in '96. In other words, the ushering in of democracy at a time when the KMT actually was still very strong. So this kind of flips the conventional wisdom of democratic transition on its head. The consequence of this, I think, is important, particularly as it relates then to the causal impact of democratization on developmentalism. That is to say, actually we see tremendous continuity, right? So that these democratization processes do not result in a political zigzag. It does not result in the political tumultuousness that we see in other democratizing regimes. In fact, we see the KMT maintaining a majority and has maintained a legislative majority throughout Taiwan's democratic period, although it's likely to lose it now. We see the KMT remaining very strong in the legislature, and of course the KMT taking the presidency in '96. So in fact, after democratic transition takes place, we see continuity and not the kind of rupturous change that we might expect. The same goes with Korea. When the Hana, or what would eventually become the Hana Party, No Tae-woo concedes in '87. There is a gamble, of course, that the opposition would split the vote. The gamble pays off. He maintains the presidency. The incumbent authoritarian turned Democratic Party maintains a plurality in the National Assembly, and indeed under Kim Yong-sam we see the consolidation of conservative forces into the DLP, which is actually in many ways very similar to the LDP. In fact, the argument we make, and this I think TJ might appreciate actually, is that Taiwan, while it's one of the best, it is the best case of the logic, the actual inspiration for this is actually the LDP in Japan. And so the argument we make in the book is that the LDP in Japan is a perfect example of a conservative transition in which democracy actually helps the conservatives and helps to consolidate the conservatives within the state apparatus and also the ruling party, which results in the emergence of the developmental state. So the first point I want to make is that democracy and democratization does not result in the political rupture and the kind of disequilibrium that we might expect a monumental political transition such as that should result in. The second point I want to make, and TJ, in terms of identifying the mechanism, that is to say, what about democratization results in discontinuities in the developmental state, TJ points to ideology and the hardening of ideology and partisanship. And the argument I want to make here is actually I don't really see that. And I think Carl alluded to what I had said, and I kind of forgot, but it actually sounded really good. This notion of ideological fungibility, right? So, in fact, in Taiwan, it was, not unlike the LDP in Japan, it was the KMT that universalized national health insurance, which is still the most expensive social welfare legislation in Taiwan. And it was the same KMT that 10 years before had rejected it, right? So this KMT before said, no, this is too expensive, this isn't part of our conservative mandate, but then upon democratization, it actually leads healthcare reform. In Korea, it's the same thing. Roh Tae-woo in 1988 and then 89 universalizes through the expansion of self-employed medical insurance in urban centers and rural centers. So again, we're talking about a notionally conservative party putting into place still the most, the hallmark, if you will, social policy legislations in both countries. And so in this respect, I think there's a bit of an overstating of the zigzag, that is to say how disparate the zigs and the zags are, but also overstating the cause of what of these zigzags. I mean, if you look, for instance, and I point to very quickly and maybe even flippantly, if you look in the short reaction, you know, Kim Dae-jung on the one hand is responsible for the Tripartite Commission and the consolidation of medical insurance funds, a very progressive reform, but at the same time also responsible for the kinds of corporate reforms that actually many have argued are quite neoliberal in character. Roh Moo-hyun, for instance, expands social care, investments on the part of the state, long-term care insurance, but justifies it as a form of active labor market policy. In Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou extends the cross-strait economic integration project with ECFA. The DPP candidate, Tsai Ing-wen, at least to date, has said that she would not reverse it, right? That it actually makes good economic sense. So in this respect, the ideological moorings that we typically associate with left-right politics, I just don't see it quite as starkly in Taiwan and South Korea, in large part because these parties have, never had an ideological commitment beforehand and have maintained a kind of fungibility, not unlike the LDP, right? I mean, the LDP in terms of expanding social insurance, the income doubling plan through the Aikida program and things like that, you know, it allowed for a kind of ideological fungibility and flexibility. So that's the second point. The third point is what I would say in terms of policy continuities. It's absolutely the case that with democracy, we have seen the emergence of new public policies. And whether it be in terms of social policy, whether it be in terms of new industrial policies, whether it be re-upping investments in upstream basic science research and so on, we've also seen in Taiwan and Korea relatively robust democracies in that we've seen alternations in the governing party. But we rarely actually see reversals. I mean, or at least, this is an empirical question, at least in the sectors that I work in and am most familiar with, I don't see any reversals. And so the argument that democracy leads to, you know, rapid policy change, short-sighted policy making and so on, I actually haven't seen these kinds of reversals. I didn't see, for instance, when the DPP comes into power, the dismantling of the health insurance program. In fact, I see the DPP making promises for old age income security, which they legislate. And when the KMT comes back in power in 2008, I don't see them dismantling that either. In fact, I see the KMT piling even more on, right? So as Dr. Lee talked about today, the expansion of social welfare spending. So I don't see the kinds of reversals that we oftentimes attribute to the zigging and the zagging, if you will, of democracy. There's lots of political noise, to be sure. right? There's lots of political noise. I mean, there's lots of political noise about ECFA, right? But, you know, Doug Fuller comes out with a very interesting study that shows the early returns on cross-strait economic relations actually hasn't been terribly out of Taiwan's favor. So despite the political noise, we actually see tremendous policy, at least again in the areas that I know, policy resilience and endurance in continuity, despite the fact that we expect, theoretically, democracy to lead to much more tumultuousness. And those are my 3 main points. So I'm not sure if that doesn't use up the 20 minutes, does it?
8 minutes.
Perfect. Wow. I hope I didn't speak too quickly then. Hope that was clear.
So TJ, back here somewhere?
I am, back here.
Do you want to go on to the next speaker or maybe just allow
Why don't you
questions?
just go ahead and take more time for discussion later on.
Keep it later on? Okay.
Do you want me to keep going? No.
No, your airfare will be 50% reimbursed, not 100%.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. Oh, well, in that case
So I think
then.
we're going to save that extra time for the audience and not for the speaker. So Professor Julian Heins will have 20 minutes, just as he did before, to give the prosecution's case on, for this.
I'm going to offer a somewhat different perspective, examining, the impact of democratization on the sustainability of the developmental state model, especially in the case of Taiwan. I would argue in the beginning that it's not enough. I would say, it's very partial simply to look at one particular sector. Okay. On the one hand, yes, all the institutional arrangement, on surface, they were kept intact. Okay. We still have the Bureau of Industrial Development. We still have the which is in charge of the industrial policy. We still have the State Development Fund, which functions as a government-owned venture capital. We still have the consultative mechanism, okay, between the trade association and the economic policymaker. And also, we still have operation like E3, which provide R&D support and organize R&D consortium for certain targeted sector. So it's all true. Okay, so on that score, you can argue continuity prevail. Okay, but how relevant, how effective these so-called intact arrangement has, on the overall economic development and industrial upgrading in particular, I would say it has become decreasingly relevant, become increasingly marginalized, and ineffective. So let me go back to I would say, the bigger picture. In the beginning, we talk about the 3 layers of insulation that make the developmental state model work, at least work, very effectively in the past. TJ identified, the economic insulation, right? The greenhouse economy. And also the security arrangement, the rigid polarity. And then, we come to the third one, that's what we call the political insulation. In the sense that the economic bureaucracy enjoys certain autonomy. It was, not captured by the rent-seeking agent, through either money politics or power peddling or nepotism, at least not extensively. I wouldn't say it's, it's no such thing as, the totally free of rent-seeking politics, but it's always, under some kind of parameter, that has been controlled and restrained. But I would argue that once you open up the electoral competition, especially when you cannot emulate the LDP, maintaining a very long-term dominant position, and you engage in kind of a cutthroat competition with other political party, or in the worst case, in the case of Chen Shui-bian, he won the presidency with only 39% of vote, and his party controlled less than 1/3 of the seat. So you have the divided government syndrome, okay? So instantly, the executive dominance, disappeared, basically. So what happened over time, I would argue that the three kind of political installation, evaporate. Number one is the insulation from rent-seeking politics. Nowadays, the big donor have direct access to the highest echelon of either party, regardless when the DPP or KMT is in power. So they can simply bypass even the Minister of Economic Affairs, okay, much less, the bureaucrat at the Industrial Development Bureau. And also that our LY, legislative realm, become really the fertile soil for modern politics, and especially with the shift in the power balance between executive and legislature. Every committee and every member of the committee, they have enough tool to twist the arm of individual ministry. Okay. Increasingly so, despite of if you look at surface, the KMT after Ma Ying-jeou, the control both the presidency and the LY. But to be, to be realistic, Ma have a co-president. The co-president is the Speaker of the House, and plus, all the weighty member. So this is a reality. This is a reality in a lot of draft bill and proposal submitted by the various economic agency. They are either pigeonhole in the LY, or the totally being modified, become unrecognizable. This happened all the time. So so it's no longer a case that So at the same time, I would argue that since a lot of those ministry, they are no longer staffed by the the traditional technocrat. Increasingly, they were filled up with political appointee. At least people who have very strong tie to the political party. So that the also break down another insulation. That's the insulation from the short-term political instinct imperative, or the populist propensity brought about by competitive logic of electoral politics. And the third thing that getting increasingly so over the last 20 years, that economic decision-making is also being held up, or sometimes, became hostage of the very excessive partisan bickering and even gridlock, especially over, this very emotional, divisive issue of identity and cross-strait. But unfortunately, the cross-relation is such a big element in the economic, decision-making, that everything has to do with the cross-relation, okay, investment, trade, things like that. So this is, I think the reason why the developmental state model that we know of, okay, really cannot really function or even survive. And let me give you just a few vivid examples, to illustrate my point. Bill, TJ, in your paper, you mentioned that the government have tried to reconfigure its policy tool to cope with the new challenge of globalization and also the competitive pressure. So the government invests, a lot in human resources, especially, create a very, very extensive system of higher education. Now, but if you look at, how the decisions were made, whether this county, should have this university, okay? In the past, all those decisions, not just, the licensing new university, but also even licensing new graduate school, will be reviewed by the Department of Human Resource of our Council of Economic Planning, okay? But that review procedure was lifted around early 90s. Okay, from that point on, the economic bureaucracy has no say over those decisions. And who are the driver behind setting up a new university? Primarily, the local constituency, and in particular, the land developer in every election district. So in the end, basically, the Ministry of Education simply gave in to those pressure. So it's driven by the campaign promise of elected representative officials. So then in that case, Taiwan end up with so many universities. On a small island, we have 160 plus. The whole island saturated. With university and four-year college, okay, and then it creates a huge problem in terms of a great mismatch in the labor market. So on the one hand, each year we produce a large number of college graduates, including liberal, with no multiple skill, okay. And so they have to settle for the job, which used to, reserved for the senior high graduate. And that suppressed the wage level for entry-level job, My graduate from my school, from my college, have the same startup salary nowadays as compared to 25 years ago. Nominal term, okay. In terms of purchasing power, it's even much lower, okay. At the same time, the industry complaining, we don't have enough technician, we don't have enough skilled worker. That constraint our capability to expand, okay. So this symptom, I would say, is simply such an anomaly to the so-called developmental state model. That shouldn't happen, if you do have, at least some degree of planning rationality, okay, in terms of how to allocate the scarce public sector resource, especially come to human resource investment. Okay, let's just give you one example, okay. Give you another example is the trade negotiation politics, okay. Okay, supposedly if the economic official has certain, I would say, autonomy, it should be able to devise some kind of its own agenda. Okay, which sector, that's our strength. Okay, we will try to, during negotiation. Okay, try to, allow it, to be able to compete more vigorously, or certain industry still probably should give it more room at home to grow. Okay. And anyway, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Economic Affairs, at least should have some kind of concept, okay, or roadmap, how to steer the negotiation, toward a set of policy choices that might, conducive to our either long-term economic growth or, to conducive to strengthening of certain strategic industry. But it's no longer the case. Whether you have, in our case, it's very passive consultation. So the official go to every meeting, with the representative from the trade association, okay? And simply, they try to identify where there's no resistance, where's the least political obstacle, okay? So they, settle for what we call the least common denominator, okay? Whenever they encounter opposition or resistance from any organized sector, with some surrogate, in the LY, okay, simply, they gave in, okay. So under this kind of model, basically, it's very difficult for Taiwan to actually successfully to strike any free trade agreement with its major trading partner, except for some exception. What are the exceptions? Singapore, okay, which have very different economy, service sector based, no agriculture, basically, or country like New Zealand, their agriculture sector produce very different product, okay, as compared to Taiwan, and also again, not much manufacturing, okay, in the case of New Zealand. And then mainland China, but China has its own political agenda, so it's willing to, offer unilateral concession. Okay, so that's only three, the free trade agreement, we are able to muddle through over the last, 10 to 15 years. So basically, the trade negotiation is, I would say, it's littered with veto player. Every single profession, industry, they can simply have their veto. Okay, so this, the case study, I would say again, really run counter to your expectation. If the developmental state model is still really, relevant, to our understanding of Taiwan's political economy. But I think the biggest, I would say, irony is that, it's no longer possible even for KMT, much less for the DPP, simply to hold the so-called developmentalist coalition together. I think, Pei San, in her presentation, illustrates that point, vividly. It's difficult for the government really to, to play the role as a, not even as a broker, among contending interests, and much less to facilitate, kind of middle row approach. Nowadays, on the one hand, a lot of sector industry, especially which heavily depend on the domestic market, okay, they become the most vocal voice in the economic decision making because they are the willing donor to both parties, to all the politicians. The export-oriented sector, which is less dependent on state regulatory, but nevertheless, they oftentimes collide with the government over, to what extent the government to regulate cross-trade investment and trade. Okay, so basically, the business sector, the domestic-oriented sector, they actually being able to be a much more effective player in shaping, the economic policy making, while the export-oriented sector oftentimes, on a colliding course with economic official. And same time, there are so many social group, in terms of environmentalists, consumer rights, all different category of ethnic minority. They simply take the issue into their own hand. They don't trust any government official at all, okay? So what they can do is to create all kind of disruption in terms, protest movement. So a lot of important, investment actually were either for that reason, to be thrown out the window or to be held up for a long, long time. A very important major petrochemical project, was thrown out the window 3 years ago. Okay, because the very vocal, and resourceful resistance from the local community. And then, the issue of income distribution, the issue of free trade, they all become so contentious in our political process. Okay, not to mention the sunflower movement. We totally disrupt this, and either this is driven by conflict over identity, but also simply different group, they're driven by their own specific concern and illogical commitment. Okay, it's very difficult for the government really to maintain a kind of mainstream or prevailing view over the national priority or the vision for Taiwan's economic development. So in the end, I argue that we a lot of the really worry about the prospect. The Taiwan might actually pretty much fall into a trap. It's very increasingly difficult for Taiwan to escape the higher middle income trap. Our business model, heavily depend on serving as the supply contractor to the multinational company, and rely on their manufacturing platform in mainland China. But their business model is cost-down business model, okay? And they are facing tremendous difficulty, moving upward on the along the value chain. But at the same time, they are facing the threat from the late-coming contractor in mainland China, increasingly. And also, I think it's it's also Taiwan's lost its momentum of investment-led growth. If you look at the ratio of fixed capital investment to the GDP, it has steadily declined over time. Okay, from the high of 40% of GDP, 38 to 40, to down to only 20. Okay, but at the same time, our banking sector is saddled with excessive saving. There's nowhere the money can go to. It's totally incapable. For either bank sector or government to channel those excessive saving into productive use. So most money went into real estate, create bubble, and also widening income gap. So this is, I think, a very challenging, situation that we found ourselves in. And I wouldn't say, democratization is the only source of explanation, okay, for this dilemma. But I think it does play a very important role, especially, creating a new political environment, which is very different from the old days. All the political insulation, insulated from the populist propensity, insulated from money politics and power peddling, and insulated from excessive partisan bickering and polarization. Yeah, I'll stop right here.
I'm sure you're all anxious to hear them fight it out more directly, but first we have a last presentation from Dr. Yongshik Bing.
Thank you. I'm a security person, as I would identify myself, so I cannot give you a detailed analysis of economic aspects of this discussion on the presence and the future of the developmental state in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So my takes will be heavily on the case of regional security and its impact on national and regional economic conditions and the case of South Korea. Two things I'd like to highlight on the onset of my presentation. One is that we have to bring in historical perspectives in our discussion of these cases. Second point is that we have to also pay more attention on the linkage between security and prosperity. Basically, the developmental states' main mission is the same as the original mission of the previous systems, whether it was a fascist or the nationalist, the rich country, strong army. Japan may not follow the same slogan, and it has been practicing absolute pacifism, strong, rich country, no army. But nonetheless, Japan has been paying the same attention on the linkage between taking care of your national security has a direct implications and premised upon keeping your foundation for sustainable economic growth and prosperity. And the other consensus coming out of the early stage onset of the developmental states in these three countries, as we know, is that there is a general consensus that individual prosperity and security are dialectically linked with the collective security and prosperity. That what is good for the nation is good for individual citizens. And if there's any clear impact of a democratic transition and the political changes in these three countries, especially in case of democratic transitions in Taiwan and South Korea, then that consensus has been heavily challenged and largely discarded, especially the change of the status of the military power as the vanguard of the national interest, when the assumption is that there is an overlap between national security and economic prosperity. So under the tent of the new professionalism, I'm citing my knowledge that I learned from my graduate seminar, the Military and Politics 101, that Samuel Huntington, that the soldiers are not the defender of the motherland against the external threat, but if you're a true soldier, patriotic soldiers, then you have to directly participate in defending your nation from internal maladies and diseases that justify the intervention of the armed forces in domestic politics, especially in case of South Korea. That democratic transition demolished this, one of the old pillars of the consensus after the end of the Second World War. I'd like to just, without being able to give you any clear and specific answers to this question, I'd like to just ask you to think of these two. First is the origin, how these development practice and institutions and the ideas of developmental states actually were conceived many years ago. It's a children. They are children of historical ruptures. Liberation from colonial occupation and the Second World War. So it's kind of these three countries took off from a previous truncated historical equilibrium. And they have been moving forward since then for the past, more than 60 years? But that does not necessarily mean that it is inevitable for them to soon reach another equilibrium. Because in the absence, considering in the absence of another major historical ruptures, probably in the form of revolutions or a world war, you name it. Because these countries, with the practice and institutions of development states, actually survived many smaller crises for the past 6 years. I had a very pleasant conversation with colleagues about the New York Mets going back to the World Series. But my last memory of the Mets doing well was 1986, right? Beating the Red Sox with the Buckner making the error, right? 1986, cursed. But since then, a lot of things happened. We no longer use Sony Walkman. We used to be so shocked and surprised when it added the function of auto reverse, right? With a cassette tape. But now we are not living with a Discman anymore. we overcame the financial crisis in 1997, 8, and another financial crisis in 2008. And now we are using iPad, and Apple is a leading company in the world. And we no longer pay as much respect for Panasonic and Sony. But Japan is still with us as a major economic powerhouse. So we have to give a benefit of doubt that these systems are supposed to be quite resilient. They are supposed to be continuous as opposed to be fluctuating or dissipating, because they are locked in a very rare and unprecedented historical equilibrium that was created structurally at the end of the Pacific War. And second point I'd like to ask you to pay attention to is these countries started this practice and institution of developmental state out of great desperation. It was a matter of sheer survival. These countries were under foreign occupation, Japan included. So the social consensus, we have to consider that their starting point was a very rare case in their own national histories. And so what has started as a very extreme, unusual, idiosyncratic practice deserve tinkerings and adoptions and changes here and there from time to time to remain the overall macro trajectory, basically fulfilling the same core purpose, which is to create and maintain their systems as a rich country and a strong army. No worry about national security. I'd like to highlight 3 points in my reactions to T.J. Penpel's paper. One is that whether, as T.J. seems to assume, that there will be growing divergence between Japan on one hand, as a country that did not experience massive and critical political liberalization in the past. So the same political machines and conservative coalitions are more or less intact and still exercising great influence on one hand, and the Taiwan and South Korea are moving in different directions thanks to their previous political liberalizations. I think, seconding Joe, then the conservative versus progressive generating oppositional policy outcomes is rather overstated. There's a lot of convergence and similarities across the different administrations in South Korea, conservative and progressive. And the second point is that it is not so clear in his paper how all these specific responses of these three developmental states to the two exogenous changes in world politics, the decline of bipolar rigidity and the penetration of the global finance. It is not really clearly stated in his paper whether all these means a fundamental paradigm shift or new pattern of the behavior or global politics, or just isolated symptoms and just lots of noises but no fundamental changes. And third point is China. Whether China, we will agree that China is an extremely important economic player in the region or even at the global scales, but whether we can also assert that China being as such means that China has replaced Japan as a regional economic hegemon. I think TJ's paper is very closer to accepting the second notion that no longer Japan has a head of the flying geese, but it is China. But I like to provide my own thoughts. Okay, first, will Japan increasingly diverge from South Korea and Taiwan? again, I cannot really talk about the case of Taiwan here, but it seems like the first stroke is that these three countries are very rare cases in human history in which the political liberalization has not been sacrificed for the sake of economic development or vice versa. These countries somehow succeeded in achieving both in a relatively short period of time. So I'd like to highlight that commonality across all these three Asian development states. So that, if we can explain what contributed to this common success for these three countries, then we'll be better able to answer the TGA's first, probe about the future of these three developmental states. I'd like to just highlight that it doesn't make such a great difference in terms of policy outcomes, whether the administration was progressive, such as the Kim Dae-jung administration or Nomu현 administration, or conservative, including the last Lee Myung-bak government or Park Geun-hye administration, because of the welfare policy was hijacked and preempted by presidential candidate Park Geun-hye during the election campaign, and still the current government is really big on the social welfare reforms, although it's a conservative leadership. And we remember that the bilateral free trade agreement between South Korea and the United States was initiated not by the conservative government, but by very progressive Nomu현 administration. So there's a lot of continuity across different administrations, despite their ideological differences. And current party politics in South Korea is very much like the party politics in Japan of yesterday, in the 60s and 70s, for the predominance of the conservative coalition or conservative party, with the contrast to the very weak and demolished opposition party and the voice of the non-government NGOs. If I may make a bold, reckless prediction without assuming any responsibility, I won't come back to UC Berkeley for the next 2 years. Maybe what we are seeing in South Korea is South Korean party politics becoming more and more like party politics in Japan in the 60s and 70s. Maybe the Conservative Centrist Party is the next LDP, and the opposition party will not be a legitimate challenger or the next successor in line in South Korean party politics. Because the Conservative Party, Centrist Party in South Korea has been really successful in transferring itself as a very immune to the ideological, division, and transferring itself as a kind of a catch-all party, targeting, specific groups like, advocacy groups of the foreign workers and multicultural systems, small and medium-sized businesses, young college graduates in search for jobs. So I don't think the dichotomy between conservative and progressive is not that important in predicting the future potential divergence between Japan on one hand and South Korea on the other hand. And even that divergence, according to the ideological divide between the conservative leadership and the progressive leadership, is not as applicable as it used to in terms of South Korea's security and foreign policy toward North Korea and China. Because thanks to the experience of very progressive and massive engagement policy for 2 consecutive administrations, Kim Dae-jung and Nomu현, toward North Korea, now South Koreans are so well informed about the real North Korea without so much exceeding expectation about what can be achieved in inter-Korean relations. And that cumulative knowledge and experience and stabilize the expectation in the general population will continue in the future party politics. So no matter which political party, progressive or conservative, hold power in the upcoming elections, then North Korea policy or the South Korea policy toward China will not be wildly swerving from one point to the other. Second point is there's a lot of very good detailed analytical descriptions about specific responses and reactions taken by South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan to the two exogenous shocks. But I wanted to even further challenge TJ to come up with a more broad stroke, a more general description of the pattern, whether we are entering into a new phase of the global politics or a regional economic system. But I think the discussions remain quite descriptive. But I don't think it is fair to blame TJ for not doing so, because basically the situation is uncertain, right? Nobody really knows how the current noises will end up new phase of the global politics. So it is only natural of these three developmental states to mainly engage in hedging behavior, and it will be too much overstating to kind of reading too much out of these temporary and very measured, limited responses by these three developmental states to current situation, as if they indicate the end of the developmental state model. Finally, the China's economic leadership in place of Japan. I would like to argue that Japan was never the hegemonic economic leader in Asia. It was the United States. So Japan was an economic leader in East Asia because United States was behind Japan. But China replacing Japan has a different implications. I don't know whether China is ready to play the role. China today does not seem to be even Japan in the 1960s to 1980s, let alone the United States for South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan when they took off for their sustainable economic growth in 50s. And security and economic interests are still very complicatedly interlinked for China and its foreign relations with these three developmental states, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. I don't think there's a clear and affordable separation between security and economics for these three developmental states. So it'll be very difficult for these countries to accept China, regardless of actual economic significance and influence of China will be in the near future as a replacement of Japan / the United States. And China is I would say, wild animal. Seriously, to put your house on. I tried to be bold and provocative because I was desperate to come up with the original arguments in response to TJ's paper. But China's experiments, the AIIB and the One Belt, One Road, these are ideas and institutions in the making, but it'll be too premature for us to, again, read too much out of these Chinese experiments. And who knows, China may be the biggest liability for these developmental states. Implosion of Chinese economy because of its under-institutionalization, political system. Who knows, in the near future, thanks to the success of Abenomics and the long-term positive effect of Japan joining TPP, Japan may pass by China again as a regional economic superpower because of its, you use a term in the previous panel, sophistication, stability, reliability, transparency. So the game is not over, in my personal opinion, between China and Japan. Thank you.
Wonderful control of time. That must be all because of me. But we do have time for about half an hour worth of discussion, and so please raise your hands and tell who you'd like to talk to. Anybody hiding behind the pillar there?
TJ.
I'll take a whack at one area where I'd like to hear all three of you engaged, and it picks up a little bit on Yongshik's point, but to the extent that Joe is right about certain policies getting put in place and then not being dismantled, I understand that, but is it the case that we did not see substantial changes in each of these three on the security dimension, on the engagement with other previous regional enemies? I mean, it seems clear to me that in Taiwan, there's a very clear distinction between KMT and DPP on how they approach foreign policy or relations with China. That may not be at odds with what you're saying, Yonhan, but I just wonder how each of you would address that issue of democratization and how it plays out in security. Are we seeing discontinuous security policies based on which party and which political mechanism is in charge? Or is there still a strong measure of continuity there?
Should we?
Who would like to go first? Yongshik, you're the closest to you, maybe? Want to start out?
I have more time to think about this.
Okay, let me.
I don't want to go first again.
Okay, so I will volunteer to go first, so allowing these two gentlemen more time to construct their argument. Well, first of all, obviously security consideration has changed in a very fundamental sense. In terms of cross-strait relation, but if you go back to the late '70s, right? The two society virtually have no contact, right? There's no economic change, and the POA, is a very imminent threat to Taiwan security. Well, the POA remain a very formidable threat to our security, but at the same time, the new reality is that Taiwan, economically speaking, becomes so much dependent on mainland China. So even DPP, have to reckon with this new reality. So it's unlikely that the DPP in the future will repeat the kind of provocation that Chen Shui-bian, at one time initiated and create, escalation of tension in the Strait, and also damage our relationship with Washington. So this is a very, I would say, but every country in Northeast Asia have to live with this kind of dilemma or contradiction. Because China is #1 trading partner with South Korea, is the #1 trading partner with Japan. And China is also one of the top destination of our foreign direct investment, coming from South Korea and Taiwan and Japan. But same time, all three, still obviously rely on the United States in terms of security commitment. But the role of the United States and the role of China, they are not mutually replaceable, unfortunately. Okay, United States cannot replace China. when it comes to economic survival. And China obviously cannot replace the United States, in terms of security consideration. I think, this contradiction and tension between the economic imperative and security consideration, I think will linger on for quite a while. But overall speaking, it definitely has the effect of, the imposing some constraining effect on, on domestic public discourse, whether it's in South Korea or Japan, or I know the big business, have very troubled by Abe's approach, to certain, security issue, and the territorial dispute. But it might really create, a very unfavorable environment for them if they want to operate, and succeed in China. And I think that even more so, for in our case. So yes, on one hand, I say I would agree with TJ that the security configuration hasn't changed much, but at the same time, how the economic consideration now increasingly might overshadow the security imperative. That's another story. And the tendency is that it will become even stronger in the future if China, its economic growth, continue, if not at the same pace, but still, very rigorously. Yeah.
Okay. Why there has been relatively absence of engagement, active engagement to reconcile with the former enemies? That's your first question. In case of South Korea, I can think of 3 former enemies, North Korea, China, Japan. In terms of Korea-Japan reconciliation, applicable to my answer to all 3 cases, that I think the history is relatively short, that Korea has tried to engage with these former enemies for reconciliation. For instance, Korea-Japan, well, during the Cold War, these countries had no effective power to engage in historical reconciliation when they were critically dependent upon security umbrella provided by the United States. They had far bigger fish to fry for survival. So historical territorial issues had not been resolved or settled by these countries during the Cold War, but they are simply agreed to be suppressed. So after the end of the Cold War, now these issues began to have a legitimate chance to be opened up and show their very complicated size. So we are still in the very early stage of engagement for reconciliation. In the baseball analogy, we are still playing April baseball game away from October, the playoffs. Although the current situation, however festering and frustrating current situation between Korea and Japan might be. Same with Korea-China. The normalization with Communist China was only in 1992, and the bilateral partnership has been decidedly on the economic front as away from security or history. So all these tricky and potentially explosive historical territory issues between the 2 countries, China and Korea, have not been directly confronted by the leadership, but rather agreed to remain in the under the rug. And with North Korea, the first Inter-Korean summit was 2000, so we are talking about only history of 15 years, still in the very experimental stage. And the lack of active engagement with the former enemy is as much the responsibility of the South Korean leadership as that of North Korea, not joining hand. The effect of democratization, I don't know, I have to look into this, but maybe it is not so much about democratization per se in South Korea since mid-1980s, but democratic transition that installed a peculiar presidential system, leadership system, which combine the presidency, however powerful it is, to a single term for 5 years. I think that must have generated an interesting effect on the change of the prototypical model of a developmental state in South Korea.
Just very quickly, I agree with what both my colleagues have said. I think if you look, democracy has brought about tremendous amounts of political noise, exacerbating the economic anxiety, particularly across the strait. But if you actually look at the policies, Taiwan's economy has been gradually integrating with that of mainland China's for a long time, and it's continued to do so unabated, regardless of which party is in power. Political noise will vary, but the actual policies are not that dissimilar.
So, Joe, I want to push you a little bit more on that. So, you could say that maybe democracy is totally overrated. That the cases of Taiwan and Korea and China tell us that we don't need it for economic growth. So I want to push you a little bit. Let's say we came in from Mars, and there's a country. You don't know much about France or the French Revolution or anything like that. What is the political system you would want to build to foster fast economic growth?
You're asking me?
President Wong, would you please build us a country that grows fast?
So I let me answer it this way. So I only spent 8 minutes on the first part. So I mean, and then I was assaulted, intellectually assaulted for the next 25. But no. So let me put it this way. So what we have. Empirically, what we've seen in terms of fast economic growth in the post-war period among these developmental states were authoritarian regimes. And I think I would probably say, in terms of rapid economic growth, catch-up development, where, for instance, wage compression is important, where you're creating comparative advantage out of in labor-intensive industries and whatnot. The leverage that you can have as a state in order to accomplish that is important. But that's not what we're talking about now, right? We're talking about these economies as of the 90s. And these economies in the 90s, so you can think about it in two ways, right? I mean, I think that we can all agree, and first of all, I'll never disagree with Yun Han anyway, but we can all agree that even from the sunflower movement to the most esteemed technocrat, there is still this expectation that the state can and should do something, right? I mean, I think this is just an ingrained expectation. And so in that case, the sunflower movement, I mean, I think it's not so much an anti-development coalition, but rather a lamenting the failure of the developmental state in continuing to foster the kinds of economic returns that the generation before the sunflower generation had to enjoy. So I think we can say that there continues to be this expectation. So the question, but the developmental state has begun to fail, right? And not in the fast growth in the 50s and 60s, but in today's economy. And there's two ways you can think about it. One is it failing because of democracy, or is it failing because of the new normal, the new economy? I mean, there are two potential variables here to explain it. And it seems to me, I mean, if it's the democracy argument, and Yun Han makes, and especially the paper in which he talks about how democratization affects the way in which the bureaucracy functions, I think that's a really valuable explication because it's one that we rarely hear about. But what we see in terms of democracy are the political distortions in both the incentives and the long-term planning capability, right? The other side of the argument would be the new economy and the profound uncertainties that come with the new economy, labor market fluctuations, labor market uncertainties, technological innovation, industrial upgrading into new sectors, more competition, faster ability of countries to rise in the global value chain. The argument I'm making is it seems to me to be more the latter, right? That what's really bedeviling these economies are the inability of these states to quite manage the uncertainties that they had once been able to do. And that doesn't seem to me to have as much to do with democracy as it has to do with the new normal. I mean, the new normal is the term that's being used in China to rationalize 5 to 6% economic growth from a decrease from 8 to 10. That has nothing to do with political regime change. That has everything to do with the new economy and the new economic challenges that China has to face as it continues to try to grow these economies. So, you know, I think there's an argument to be made from both sides. It's just in my own work, when I've looked at, for instance, a non-democratic regime like Singapore, its inability to manage its move into the higher value-add innovation sectors has less to do with the political regime type and more to do with the inability of the state to try to manage the uncertainties that it once was able to do. I mean, it was actually, you know, you build the infrastructure, you invite in the multinational corporations, you build in the backwards and forwards linkages, you're going to create jobs. But they're not making drugs, right? I mean, besides maybe video gaming and the video industry, I mean, you know, they're not on the cutting edge. And that has more to do with the new normal of their economics, I think, than it does the regime type. So in answer to your question, 50s and 60s, it's hard to argue against what worked, right? Particularly in terms of creating that comparative advantage labor-intensive industries. But that's not the challenge. I mean, these economies are not going to become rich or stay rich by staying in manufacturing and labor-intensive manufacturing. It's just not their future.
If I may, I don't know whether it's a good answer to your question, but if I were a supreme leader, not like Kim Jong-un or others, but I have to gain weight first. I would like my country to be most nimble in terms of copying, emulating the best practice out there. So what has to be taken into account is that these developmental states, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, are extremely pragmatic and adaptive, despite the fact they are also very much representative of a resilient nationalism, right? But think about it. All these three countries, the leaderships, agreed to allow foreign troops to stay in their own sovereign territories. Had it not been for the Sino-US rapprochement, that Taiwan would have continued to host the U.S. troops for national security. So, these countries are very nimble in terms of adopting the international standards and practices, like foreign schools, language educations, and foreign direct investment. Greg pointed out that if we only see these cases individually, it must be very frustrating for the lack of adaptability. But if we compare these three countries to Southeast Asian countries or other countries outside the Asia-Pacific region, then these countries are very fast and nimble. So the effect of democratization, my point is not so much about discounting the positive effect of democratization on the long-term growth potential of national economy. It is about relatively little effect of the ideological shift as a part of the democratic process in politics. So they're pragmatic. And the democratization allow the leadership to remain incentivized to, as Joe said, that going after the higher value-added economic frontiers by global standards, rather than just remain inward-looking.
So, we'll start by saying this question is out of bounds in two respects. One is,
thank you. One is it's out of bounds because I want to try to push back a little bit. What I understand Professor Wong's argument about the irrelevance of democracy to be, and it's out of bounds because I missed your actual presentation. So I'm going to badly, I'm going to be badly mischaracterizing its subtlety. It's also out of bounds because I'm sort of an interloper in this conference, so I mainly work on micro-level political behavior in the US context. So observing this conference for me is a little bit like being a catfish stuck in some muddy banks and watching birds fly 10,000 feet above the air. But But the view from the mud, as I hear your argument, is that democracy is somewhat irrelevant to this issue, in the sense that of democracy being about regime type and kind of Jim Scott's inconvenience of losing. And what really matters is something like managing uncertainty. And so what I'm wondering is whether or not you can flip that argument on its head in two ways. One is to one is to ask whether or not a particularly narrow kind of Jaworski type conceptualization of what democracy is actually driving your argument. And in what I heard in Professor Chu's remarks is at least a more robust conception of democracy that included non-electoral considerations, protest politics, identity politics, and so on. And maybe one way of asking that is to ask whether or not the process of democratization can itself be its own independent source of uncertainties that, you know, centralized governments, whether or not they're, regardless of regime type, will have to actually deal with.
That's a great question. So part of the argument that I make in my introductory comments was actually to move away from the Jaworski procedural minimalist conception of democracy and actually say that what's interesting about these places is that you have a kind of ideological, I called it ideological fungibility and flexibility, whereby you have really robust, I mean, my first book was on the welfare state. I mean, you have really robust public policies that are being developed precisely because of the competitive incentives that come with democracy, be it in terms of igniting civil society movements and the linkages that they form with bureaucracies and so on. So I don't want to, I mean, Yonhan's points are, I mean, they're absolutely correct in terms of the observations that they're drawing, is that there are a whole bunch of new linkages, a whole bunch of new veto points that are emerging, and so on. What I'm just trying to evaluate is the causal impact of that, and also as it relates to TJ's paper. And so in my original comments, the main point I really wanted to hammer home was that there was a kind of overstating of the zigging and the zagging. That is to say that these disequilibria were not nearly as tumultuous as we think, and it's to overstate then the causal impact of democracy on this, because actually we see the contestants within democracy actually falling into kind of a new line, one that's generally accepted, except for the challenges that these new economies face now. And the other point I wanted to stress in my introductory comments was that despite alternations in power, a robust democracy by every measure, we actually see tremendous policy continuity. That you don't see incumbent governments' policies, be they economic, social, environmental, even security, being dismantled in toto upon the entry or the election of a new government. Which is, if you think about it, that's the larger, you know, debate here is the whole the whole argument against democracy is that democracy, you know, leads to this kind of chaotic political economy. And in fact, what we see in at least the two, now in fact I would even say in Japan, in the three cases, you have a kind of conservative transition with a relatively consistent set of policy imperatives and policy outcomes that I think are actually remarkably consistent given how much political noise actually happens in these three places.
Professor Wong's, last comment sort of resonates with the idea that Professor Wong suggested that the state is very nimble. Nimble not only in the sense of responding to the economic imperatives, priorities, but also responding to domestic, political, social changes and new kinds of demands being placed on the state. The state still knows how to sort of respond to them in a relatively stable way, a successful way, effective way, even to the point of co-opting some of the domestic opposition forces. I wonder if that analysis or characterization of these three states applies to security issues as well, in terms of new challenges that is being presented let's say, by the relative decline of the United States, or at least the relative decline in the perception of these three states with respect to the credibility of the U.S. security commitments and guarantees, being challenged by the rising China. We, as you were saying, we are just in the early stages of the states being able to demonstrate their nimbleness, perhaps, or not. So it's hard to tell how they're going to respond to the dramatically changing balances of power in East Asia in the next 10, 15, 20 years. But I wonder if you could venture to speculate about the nimbleness in the security realm.
Can I start, actually, if I may? I mean, and I'd love to hear Julian Heins' reaction to this, because I don't know if it's right or not. I mean, I think on the one hand, in terms of the domestic challenges that you've raised, that you know, I think that, and for Julian Heins' book on the handbook on democratization, he asked me to write the chapter on the welfare state. These are remarkably dynamic economies that have accommodated phenomenal social policy change and regime shifts in response to changing demography, changing levels of inequality, changing labor markets, and so on. And I also think, with respect to the cross-strait, and I'd love to hear the reaction of colleagues of mine from particularly those in Taiwan who frankly have to live with this, I actually think in many ways Taiwan has engaged China extremely strategically, extremely nimbly, and very well, and quite unexpectedly, given the enormous political constraints on the island, right, to actually not engage China. I mean, if you actually look at, there was a time I remember when I was, there were some people in the DPP, actually it was in the Taiwan Solid at TSU, they're like, we've got to restrict the movement of scientists from across the Taiwan Strait because this would, the Chinese are just going to steal everything. And that was just a stupid policy, right? And it never became a policy because Taiwan didn't pursue these stupid policies. So even though there was a lot of intense political contestation within Taiwan that could have led it to make pretty stupid policies, I think it's actually engaged China pretty well. And when you look at the actual early returns on the cross-strait economic relationship, it's actually quite to the benefit of Taiwan, right? I mean, it's moving offshore things that, frankly, and again, I understand in terms of the loss of jobs, but frankly, Taiwan's labor market has basically priced itself out of the market for it anyway. So I actually think, despite the constraints and the politics, it's actually done pretty well. Now, I don't know what. I like Ma Ying-jeou's policy, and I think Tsai Ing-wen is going to as well. I don't think she has a choice in the matter, frankly.
Well, let me try to, coming from another point of entry. I think, through engagement, economic engagement and cultural engagement, I would say it does have the effect of lower the tension in cross-strait, and also increase, the constraining power of continuity and stability. At the same time, I would say to make PRC regime be more patient and reticent, so that in the mainland China domestic political debate, the ultra nationalists, they wouldn't be able to push very hard on the reunification agenda. Because the leaders can say, look at what we have accomplished, right? Now we have direct air and sea link, so many people travel back and forth, mutual investment, things like that, yeah. But whether Taiwan, I would say, overall speaking, I agree with Joe that Taiwan benefit from this economic exchange. Especially Taiwanese company. Some of a company would not be possible to grow as fast. Country like Hong Hai, right? It's now the 31st largest company in the world. And without, its fast expansion of manufacturing platform in China, this could not be possible. But what worry a lot of people on the island that now a lot of industry have been, move out, and not only the finishing assembling line, but also increasingly the whole cluster, the entire supply chain, and whether we will be able to incubate or to foster the growth of enough new industry to fill up, the vacuum in terms of employment, I think that really is the most challenging question, and so that's why on Taiwan there's still a lot of contention over whether the government should to be more the permissive in terms of regulating the cross-strait exchange, especially the investment flow. But the Taiwanese company are facing a dilemma. Okay, because our technological leading edge is very limited. We maybe we're ahead of China 5 years in certain sectors, 3 years in others. Okay, so if you don't allow those high-tech companies to set up their beachhead in China early enough, pretty soon they will be overtaken by the Chinese competitor. So it might be counterproductive if you try to
simply
keep postponing this window opportunity. So that's kind of the dilemma that we are facing right now. Yeah.
The question is whether these developmental states being nimble for survival and prosperity can continue, or they may lead to unwanted false step, falling off the cliff. I think South Korea's security policy can continuously remain nimble and effective by and large because nothing has really changed thanks to North Korea. Seriously, as long as North Korea continues to be North Koreans, and it's like you're basically taking the same exam questions from the same textbook in the same course administered by the same professor. Wording might be a little bit changed, but basically your preparation and the expectation remain stable. And China has not really changed its policy toward the two Koreas in a fundamental way. There is a great disappointment expressed by the South Korean public that China did not take clear position in accusing and prosecuting North Korea when it launched the two provocations to South Korea. So as long as North Korea remains grave, hybrid, and direct threat to national security of South Korea, then South Korea's strategy is very clean set, U.S. alliance with the United States. And unlike the cross-strait strategic engagement by Taiwan, South Korea has an option as such, because economic disparity and refusal by North Korean regime to open up. So that strategy is simply unavailable to South Korea.
You do have another option, although it's very limited and indirect. Your engagement with Beijing, and through Beijing you might exert some constraining influence on North Korea. So that's
right. Yeah, that's a possibility, but the track record has been disappointing. China has not changed its balancing strategy toward the two Koreas. So we have to wait and see. Maybe the next nuclear test by North Korea will be an important test to see where China stands.
So on that note, with China lurking in the background, as always, I call this session to an end and would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent presentation.